I'd like to welcome everyone here today. Obviously, this is an extremely important and timely meeting, as over 400 tons of bombs have been dropped by the Israelis on the world's largest open-air prison, one of the most densely populated places on the face of the earth, the Gaza Strip. While the people of Gaza are suffering under the attacks from one of the most powerful militaries in the world, we are very lucky today to have a speaker who many of you may already know. She is an academic and an author from the University of Exeter, the author of many books including Married to Another Man and In Search of Fatima, a book which Edward Said once described as a novelist's envy. I can't imagine I will ever hear such a compliment before I leave this earth, but I think Ghada Karmi has more than earned that. She's a regular speaker and advocate for the rights of the Palestinian people here in Britain, often on television, radio, writing for newspapers, magazines and journals. I hope you would give a very warm welcome to today's speaker, Ghada Karmi.
It's very good to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation. I've just come from Jordan, where, of course, they're obviously quite close to the action on two fronts. On the crisis in Palestine, but also, and we must not forget, the threat coming over from Iraq via this relatively new group of Islamists called ISIS. And there really is a threat to Jordan, because this group, which appears to be quite serious, whatever we may think about them, they are organized, they are determined, and they have a plan. And that is very scary. And they've already executed parts of their plan. They wanted a territory from which to operate. They said we would not be effective unless we have the territory, but they have it now, as you know. They've taken over parts of northern Syria and northern Iraq, quite a large part. And in their sights are, of course, many places, but Jordan is next on their list. So, you know, in a way, when the Palestine crisis erupted, people were torn between their fear of ISIS and what might be happening, and of course the problem of Palestine, because you know most of Jordan's inhabitants are Palestinians. So, you know, there we are. But today it's not ISIS I'm obviously speaking about, but the crisis in Palestine and what's been happening. Well, you know, I wanted to say to you, quite honestly, maybe I'm going to give up talking about Palestine. I'm tired of the recurrent crises, the recurrent tragedies which repeat themselves over and over again. It's the same pattern, you must have noticed. Israel attacks helpless people. It has all the cards, it holds all the cards. The world's major powers support Israel, and that's a fact, you know all that, I know. And the world's media, the Western media rather, represent Israel's viewpoint more than anybody else's. It's the same scenario, and it repeats itself over and over. It is sickening. And you say to yourself, in my position, what is the point of going on talking about how beastly Israel is? It is beastly. How many times do we need to say this? It is a brutal, nasty, oppressive, colonial power, but it's doing what it wants, and it's getting away with it. Isn't that surely the point? The point is not to continue endlessly giving out statistics, data on the number of Palestinians killed, the number of children. We've heard it before so many times. It doesn't make any difference. Why not? Because Israel has total impunity. Total impunity. And unless that is attacked, unless that is dealt with, forget the rest. Forget the rest. The rest is humanitarian, very nice, very pleasant. It's nice for Palestinians to know somebody cares. It doesn't actually make any difference. And that I've lived through again and again. So let's just recap the latest horror that's going on briefly, because I dare say you're aware of the major events. As you know, there was a kidnapping on the 12th of June, a so-called kidnapping, because it has since emerged that the kidnap that wasn't, you know, the three young settlers who were taken away in somebody's car were killed very soon after. And the Israeli government knew it. Now we know that now. The Israeli government knew it. But they had a plan in place which they had been itching for a trigger, for an excuse to try and execute, which was to have another assault on Hamas. But behind that is the objective of destroying any possibilities of a peace process. Now, Israel had been evading any possibility that a peace process would succeed, that there might be a peace settlement at some point, had evaded that extremely effectively over decades. Why? Because, and I'm not telling you anything new, I'm simply recapping here. Why? Because Israel has a plan, and Israel executes its plans, and it doesn't allow anything to interfere with its plan. Now, the plan may be slowed down at one point, or it may go a little bit faster at other points, but the plan remains the same. The plan is to take over the whole of the territory between the Mediterranean and the river, and the Jordan River. That's the plan. And if you look, if you just stand back and get away from the, you know, the daily dramas and the things that are happening, you will notice that the plan is doing very well, because more and more Palestinian territory has been taken over by Israel, and it is proceeding with its colonial project extremely successfully. Now, the real danger to Israel, to the colonial project, I mean, is if there is a peace process which is successful. Because you can, of course, realize that if there is to be a peace settlement, Israel would be required to do something. You cannot have a peace settlement with Israel remaining exactly the same. That is clear. Now, Israel is not interested in changing any of its plans, and it has absolutely no intention of drawing a border, of ceding territory in a peace settlement. So, the game for Israel is to evade any possibility of a successful peace process. Now, this time, the latest one, with John Kerry, Kerry himself said that the fault was Israel's. The reason that the thing hadn't got anywhere was because of Israel. And of course, when Mahmoud Abbas was playing a game himself, his game was continue to abide by whatever is required of the Palestinian side in order for the Palestinians not to be blamed for a breakdown of the process. So when Israel objected, one of its things was, well, how are we going to have a peace settlement when Abbas represents the West Bank and, you know, there is no other party, but of course there is Gaza. How's that going to work? So he went ahead and produced a unity agreement with Hamas. And the moment that happened, that was extremely threatening to the Israelis, because it meant that they would have to go back to the negotiating table. I mean, what excuse was there? It was a united Palestinian front, and therefore they would be asked to come back, be asked by the Americans to come back, and they had no intention of doing that. So what I'm trying to say to you is drawing the context here for these acts, because they really are dictated by a clear Israeli strategy. So what happened? Okay, so these three young settlers were killed very soon after they were taken into, as I say, somebody's car, because to this day we do not know who did it. The Israeli government knew that, but it chose to play this drama which persuaded everybody that they had to hunt for these 3 settlers, and of course they were justified in destroying a lot of material, installations, houses, all sorts of things in the West Bank. We hadn't even got to Gaza, in the hunt for these 3 settlers. And in so doing, they killed 18 people, they arrested and imprisoned over 500 people, and you know, so the thing then marched on, and on June the 29th, the Israeli army targeted a Hamas operative in Gaza and killed him with a missile. Now, the moment that happened, Hamas, which had actually observed the terms of a ceasefire with Israel, which was started in November 2012, the last time there was an assault on Gaza, said, the ceasefire is over. When that happened, so they then started firing missiles at Israel. Precisely what Israel wanted. When that happened, the Israelis have started to move in. So, as you know from last Monday, we have an all-out assault on Gaza. And today, the figures from the BBC anyway, today was 80 dead, of whom at least 20 are children, over 500 wounded, bombardment by air and by sea. Don't forget the naval bombardment that goes on outside the Gaza Strip. Houses, infrastructure, fields, orchards, any factory left standing has been bombed. As I say, the rockets have persisted, have continued from the Gazan side. Now, here we pause and we observe, yet again, the media reaction to this and the reaction of world leaders to this. And, of course, you know what's happened. The media, first of all, today, by the way, I can hardly find any news of Gaza on the main media. It's not of particular interest, you know. There's more about, you know, about Brazil having lost the World Cup, and there's also stuff now about the surveillance, the law that's going through Parliament, and so on. Gaza, you know, hardly merits a mention. And there's the usual BBC business with interviewing people who give the Israeli viewpoint, etc. But I won't bore you with that because you know it. And Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, comes out with a condemning Hamas for sending out rockets and saying they must stop that. And then the familiar call, which we've heard again and again, called for restraint on both sides. You know, again, the assumption of equivalence between these two grossly unequal parties, and on it goes. Just a word about the rockets, because, you know, this is quite persuasive. It's very persuasive, this argument. Israel has been brilliantly, has managed the public relations on this very, very well. Most people are quite convinced that they imagine, I mean in their mind, that there are these horrendous rockets, terrifying rockets, raining down from the sky on poor, helpless civilian communities in Israel, etc. In fact, the Israelis know very well that the rockets stopped as per a ceasefire agreement, quite apart from the fact that the rockets are small, are poorly targeted, don't do anything, and this last lot haven't killed a single Israeli. I'm not saying that they should, but let's have a sense of proportion. They haven't killed a single Israeli. 80 Palestinians are dead through the bombing, and another 18 were killed in the West Bank. Not a word about that, but the Secretary General talks about Hamas must stop the rockets, and there must be restraint on both sides. So the result of all that is pretty frightening, because we know now that the Israeli army has been given a, quote, a free hand by Israel's government. The Israeli army has a free hand to deal with Gaza and do whatever is needed to do. I saw an interview with the head of the army where the interviewer asked him, what does that mean? And he said, well, I'm certainly not going to share that with you, but I can assure you that we will do all that we feel necessary to restore to restore peace and security. So, you know, you can imagine how terrible that is. The reality is, as I said, and we really mustn't lose sight of that. I'm not going to go on any more about what is happening now because it's appalling. And we've been here before, you know that. I mean, 2008 to 2009, hideous assault on Gaza, 1,400 people killed, infrastructure ruined and damaged. To this day, it's not being repaired because of Israel's insistence on not allowing building materials to go in. Gaza, let me just say, is in an absolutely appalling condition, really appalling. Quite apart from the figures for below the poverty line, dependence on international agencies, all these things which somehow, you know, people hear, and then you hear them sometimes, you think, oh dear, you know. But now what's new is we have a government in Egypt which has closed off the borders very effectively and destroyed most of the tunnels on which the Gazan people were living. The things that were coming through the tunnels were essentials, and they no longer come through the tunnels because of what the Egyptians did. So the Gazans are living a blockade from Israel and from Egypt. Now, sometimes, you know, I used to ask myself, I wonder what is behind it? I mean, do they really imagine? Do Israeli leaders lie down at night and think, you know, if only these Gazans would all drop dead? And the Egyptians evidently think the same thing. The Egyptian government, I mean, evidently thinks the same thing. Well, you know, 1.8 million people, you know, a slow death is all that I can say. Okay, so let's get back to what this is really about, and then hopefully to what the way we should start to approach it if we want to help. So let me say again, Israel has a strategy and it's doing it. Its goal is very clear and it is determined. As a result, it will stop, it will put obstacles, it will prevent any kind of settlement from happening. So that's one. Second is the question of impunity that I talked about. Now this is very, very serious because I currently do, and you all live in a country which participates in that impunity. It colludes with it, as do all Western states. They all collude in granting Israel total impunity. I cannot think of a single place on earth where what is happening now in Gaza could possibly happen without any condemnation of the aggressor. Can you imagine if China was doing this in, I don't know, Taiwan, even in ex-Yugoslavia, if the Serbs had attacked Kosovo, for example, there would be no way that people would keep quiet. This is the one spot on earth where there is silence and complicity. So I suggest that we think about that complicity and the impunity given to Israel, because I assure you, and I'm sure you know it, as long as that lasts, nothing will change. Israel is very powerful. It can do what it wants. The Palestinians are very weak. They're quite helpless. If this strong party continues to do what it wants without the slightest fear or threat of punishment, it will continue to do it. It's terribly simple. So we have to think about that. Now, those are the two things really we have to focus on. Now, are there any hopeful signs? Well, by the way I'm speaking, I would think you'd pick up from me that there are none. I feel I cannot help it, because this repeats itself over and over again, and it is very hard to keep up this level of optimism, saying, yes, but, you know, the people will triumph and so on. This is a different world. There are different contexts here, and this is a different set of rules. You know, I sometimes sort of imagine that, you know, we could be talking like this in 10 years from now, if I'm still going strong, really. And, you know, another atrocity, another horrendous thing that Israel is doing. And again, people will, now my guess is this particular round will take the shape of previous ones. There will be a halt at some point when Israel has bombed enough and destroyed enough. There will be some kind of ceasefire, as it were, mediated probably through Egypt, and the Gazans will try and repair the damage that's been done, and everybody will go on again with this farce. So, what are the solutions that have been put forward? Because obviously, many different actors involved in this have tried over the years to think of a way to solve this problem. And the one that is most favored is the two-state solution, as you know. And so people talk about this. And what is so striking about it is that there are these two levels of discourse. It's quite extraordinary. You know, you could think you'd gone mad, because there is a reality on the ground in which Israel is continuing its colonial project and is making it impossible for there to be adequate territory for a Palestinian state, particularly in Jerusalem. And then there's this other order of reality in which people meet and talk about the two-state solution, and they discuss it, and politicians talk about it. It's quite extraordinary. And there's no kind of meeting between these two orders of reality. You could really imagine you'd gone mad. Not long ago, I was invited to a debate with the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, organized by the New Statesman, and it was done at the House of Commons, small group of MPs and some people from the House of Lords, and the discussion was quite brave of the New Statesman, very interesting. Is a one state the way forward? That was the kind of title of the debate. You know, what I want to tell you is that they went round the room, and the MPs, each one, said how concerned they were with Israel's security, and that must be assured whatever happened, and sort of that was their starting point. And then I was asked to speak, and I talked about the fact that there was this colonial project. I talked about the fact that the whole project, the whole Israeli project, is a settler colonial project, quite a classic one, in fact. And it's not, you can see, it takes the shape and form of other settler colonialisms, and that's how it has to see it. Because once you see it like that, you stop talking about this equivalence, etc. So I said all this, and I talked about the fact that the two-state solution, the two-state idea, is utterly irrelevant to a settler colonial project. It doesn't really, it can't happen, because that's not what the project is about. And the project is being run by people who are very powerful, so it can't happen. Anyway, I went on as a Palestinian and talked about all sorts of things. And then Ilan Pappé spoke next, and he talked about the two-state solution as a corpse. He said it's dead, but nobody is willing to bury this corpse. And he talked about the necrophilia. It was quite striking that people display towards this corpse, unwilling to let it go, you know. Anyway, let me assure you, the point of this story is that after we'd expended every kind of eloquence we knew on his side and on mine, everybody in that room, except one, I have to say, everybody said, "Oh, well, thank you very much, it was very interesting." Anyway, about this two-state solution. So there is this idea of a two-state solution which is floating about, and which of course will not happen. And many of us talk about a one-state solution, we talk about a sharing, we talk about this idea which negates the settler colonialist project, etc. But I don't plan to talk about that just now. I just set that aside for a moment, because it is also unrealistic. The two-state solution is out of the question, but the one-state solution at the moment is quite unrealistic. Why do I say that? Because of what I've been talking about before. The level of impunity that is allowed to Israel and the amount of support Israel still enjoys. It's tremendous. So given that, you don't even have an even playing field. You don't even have two parties where the one says to the other, listen, how about we live together? And the other one might say, no, no way, I'm not interested, etc. We have a situation which is worse than that of South Africa, in case it occurs to any of you to say, ah, yes, but it happened in South Africa. This is worse, much worse. The complicity with Israel, the effect Israel has on Western governments and Western elites is quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And therefore we have to deal with what is real. Now that really, in a way, takes me to talk a little bit about the sort of things that can be done. Now, first of all, obviously, if anybody in this room is not aware of the picture I have drawn, they certainly need to be. So that's the first thing that has to be clear, and it's a thing that has to be made clear to other people, that this is what is really going on, and this is not an issue of Jews and Arabs and and different sort of analysis. I don't mean crude things, but really quite sophisticated analysis. No, it's not. It's a very simple issue, a settler colonialist project, which is given carte blanche to do what it likes. That's what it is. That's what it is. So we've got to face that. And that is the message that has to go out everywhere, in fact, to disabuse people of the idea of the accumulated rubbish that they've been told over many, many years. But of course, that brings me, therefore, also to talk about BDS. And I think BDS is really important. It's really important because it is a tool we can all use, arguments you know very well. This is a tool we can all use, and it is the counter to the impunity that Israel has. Clearly it is. So if Israel is getting a message from the establishment, from world governments, from elites saying, you can do what you like, don't worry, it's okay, we understand, the people are giving a completely counter message. They're saying, no, it is not all right, it is not acceptable, and we don't want to have anything to do with a state that behaves in this way. So I think it's much more important even than the people who practice it realize. I really do, because this is precisely the kind of trajectory we need, meaning, I don't mean anything corny like people power, I mean things that civil society can do, that ordinary people do, that people can get together and do, and that it tries to counter the pernicious setup that we have to deal with. So there is, of course, BDS, and secondly, because I'm speaking to an audience here in London and not in Jordan and not in Ramallah or anywhere else, you live in countries whose governments are complicit with this project, and therefore the attempts, the work has to be done on every level of power which colludes with this project. That's what has to be done. And I assure you that's what the Palestinians look for. They appreciate expressions of support, they appreciate people coming out and bearing witness and all this stuff, but really it doesn't get them to where they want. And I know from many Palestinians who've told me we are fed up with the number of delegations, visitors, people who come out, express a lot of sympathy, might help out here and there, might do a bit of teaching, might teach a bit of music, but then inevitably they go back and our misery continues. What they want is that you work here on the very centers of power which are maintaining this rotten and pernicious relationship between Israel and its backers. And the more of us there are, the more it will work. BDS is the best example. Remember a few years back, if I'd been giving this talk, it would have not, it's not like that today. Look at the strides that have been made in the BDS movement, and that's the way it has to be. Now, it may be that I want to just anticipate a question in my final remark about an intifada. Will there be a third intifada, etc.? Well, I don't think there will be, although this particular assault has brought out the Israeli Palestinians, and that's a very interesting development. They've all come out, rioting, rebelling, expressing their rejection and their anger at what the government of Israel is doing. Now, that's a significant development, because although such things have happened before, this time there have been more riots, more demonstrations, indicating that the level of identification between Palestinians, citizens of Israel, and the Palestinians living under Israel's occupation, whether in the West Bank or Gaza, is much higher than it used to be. Now, you could say there's a pointer for the future, and it may be, but we are living in a situation where it is impossible to predict, and I think it would be wrong to predict. We deal with what we have. And I want to leave you with this message: Israel's impunity must be smashed, otherwise we will get nowhere.
My name's Mike Waterman from Brighton, and I wanted to talk about BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions. I've been involved in a campaign that's lasted 2 years involving SodaStream, an Israeli company that's got a factory on occupied territories on a settlement. And they opened 2 years ago, they opened a shop in Brighton called Eco Street, and a green shop, and the idea, because Brighton's got a green reputation, with refillable bottles. And so that was the idea, to present it as being ethical. But Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Brighton, we organised a regular protest outside the shop. 2 years we kept going, every Saturday afternoon. And we faced Zionist opposition to us. So it was this real spectacle with Palestinian flags and Israeli flags, and 20 to 30 on each side. Now, sometimes we even got beaten in terms of numbers by the Zionists, but the important thing was that we had community support. And we showed that by a trade union day in which we had 8 trade unions there, 20 people, 4 trade union banners. And we built a campaign, we got a fantastic response. We used the pickets to raise other issues like apartheid and house demolitions. And last week, we won. The shop was closed down. It just happened on the same day as John Lewis decided not to stock SodaStream stuff. So you can win, and so I would ask everyone here to get involved in your local Palestine Solidarity campaign, because everywhere there's Israeli goods being sold, and in lots of places there's SodaStream stuff. So keep up the work and free Palestine.
Thank you. We'll take this gentleman here, followed by the woman in the middle with the striped shirt.
Yeah, Rada's absolutely right. There was a tremendous difference between the experience of black people in South Africa and the Palestinians. In South Africa, the black population was super exploited, but they were exploited. The whites needed their labor. Palestine was completely different. In Palestine, the Palestinians were expelled by the Zionist settler colonial population, by the Zionist state, the state of Israel. And that means that the Palestinians cannot liberate themselves. They put up magnificent resistance, but in the end, they certainly don't have the military power, they don't have the economic power in the way that the black South African working class had economic power. So it is incumbent on us, on all of us, to do what Ghada said and what the last speaker said, which is to really involve ourselves in Palestine solidarity work. Things have changed, though. I'm old enough to remember a time when Israel was considered a progressive state, even a socialist state. You know, idealistic young people in the 1960s used to go to Israel to spend a year on a kibbutz. You don't hear much about the kibbutz these days. Today, idealistic young people go to spend time in a Palestinian village. And that betokens a tremendous step forward. Of course, as I said, the Palestinians, I think we can't think about the liberation of Palestine in isolation from the liberation of the Arab world as a whole. And I think that has to be emphasized as well. There was a tremendous step forward with the outbreak of the Arab Spring, the Arab Revolution. A good Palestinian friend of mine, when I rang him up, he lives in Jaffa, I said, what do you think of the Egyptian revolution? He said, the gates of my freedom have been opened. And that was, I think, a tremendous way. Of course, there have been terrible setbacks, but I think they are temporary. In the end, the Arab working class will defeat imperialism and their local despotic regimes. And I think also, finally, in Britain, I think we have a particular responsibility. After all, the Balfour Declaration was issued by a British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, in 1917, who gave away Palestine to the Zionist movement. So, also, let's bear in mind what Netanyahu said not too long ago, a few months ago. BDS is beginning to bite. The Israelis are becoming worried by the tremendous solidarity being shown to the Palestinians, in particular by the BDS movement. So, comrades, let's keep up the pressure. Let's get involved. You know, go join your local Palestine Solidarity branch if you've got one. If you haven't got one, start one.
Thank you. After the woman coming up to speak just now, we'll have the gentleman on the far left, not to pass judgment.
I want to ask, is ISIS occupy the part of Iraq and Syria and want to expand to Jordan? Is this very benefit for the Palestinian resistance against Israel and helping them for the independence? That means it divides into spaces. Second, what is the best solution to minimize the casualties? That means minimize the injured or death.
Speak up, please.
And three, apart from the dropping the bombs into each other, is there any other way? And did you pray to God? Because we believe in God. I believe the Palestinian believe in God. Is this way, please God or Lord, did you pray about it?
Person in the middle there, next.
Yeah. Okay, thank the scholar for the talk. I did find it a little bit depressing, and I just want to, for very good reasons, for very good objective reasons, it's not a good time for the Palestinians at the moment. At the same time, I do think that some things are changing, and things that we can take, at the very least, a little hope in. First, in the consciousness of people in the West, I think there has been a massive shift, certainly since the occupation of Lebanon, since the Gaza flotilla, where your average person who you talk to in the pub or you talk to at work has gone from a position of thinking this is much too complicated or isn't Israel under threat to having an instinctive sympathy with the Palestinians. Sympathy is not the same as being an active campaigner, but an instinctive sympathy, and I think this is a shift. And the other thing is that for other situations, with national situations, the position of the US has got a lot more complicated with the debacle in Iraq and Afghanistan, but now that they're even talking about allying with Iran against ISIS makes a very much more complicated position for the US again in the region, which makes things more difficult. In that thing, I think there are some simple arguments which we can use, which will get a quite wide response. As when Obama and John Kerry come with wring their hands and say, well, we've tried our best, but the problem is we can't get Israel to budge. We would love Israel to come to an accommodation. There's a simple thing that you can do. You stop foreign aid to Israel. Stop sending them weapons. Stop giving half of your foreign aid to Israel. It's not going to put a impoverished state in Africa, and that the US is in quite a position to be able to change it. If it's without the support, the Israeli economy would be in no situation to survive, and the Israelis would have to come to negotiations. So what we know is that the US government has no interest, of Democrats or Republicans, has no interest in losing its ally in the area where as long as there's so much oil there. But if we can build the campaigns on these things in saying there are interests, there are things we can do, but also there's movements which are not powerful. The Palestinians are in a strong position, but the development of the movements in local villages in the West Bank, which are aligned with each other, which are taking a tactical position of non-violence, but supporting the right to resistance. And as in the last point, you said you're talking to people in Britain and saying we should talk about our government being complicit. I think you should say the same thing to the people in Ramallah, that the position of Abbas and the position of the Palestinian Authority is fully complicit with what Israel is doing, that Abbas has become part of the problem, has been encouraging the attacks against Gaza almost, and that any solution will be with the Palestinians, with the movement in the West, but it will be a movement in the end against Abbas as well as against Israel.
Thank you. And then after this speaker, we'll have the person in the back corner.
So, as an Arab and as a Palestinian, I think that the only way that the Palestinians can really succeed in their revolution and in liberating a Palestine that is free from occupiers, dictators, and people who say that they have a democracy, but they don't actually have a democracy because it is one that oppresses a people and children. As you know, that I don't know if you know, but there was a statistic that actually most people, the majority of people who are in jail today in Israel are actually around the age of 10 to 15 years old, and they are Palestinian children. And I believe that the only way that the Palestinians can free themselves is by not restraining themselves in their revolution and reacts. That no, they shouldn't think that we must restrain ourselves from doing what we want and what we think will free ourselves because America, America and Europe, these great countries that have done nothing for us and have done nothing for Arab states. Maybe the people support us, but their governments don't support us. They never have supported us, and what they've done is simply come to our countries and say that they'll provide democracy, but all they've done is destroy our countries, bomb them, kill civilians, and then walk out saying, we're the greatest nation on earth, where we've helped everybody, and they feel like heroes. And then, the Palestinian people and the Arab people have felt, well, we want to help them because apparently they're such a great nation, but every time that they've tried to help us and every time we've tried to work with our ideals, it's become worse than what we started with. And so I believe that instead of also taking the revolution away from the people who are winning democratically, like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, we must, throughout the Arab world, support them, but also as socialists, we must influence left ideals into the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and say, okay, right, you're Muslims, how can we make leftism, how can we mix leftism with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then we can achieve our goals in ending imperialism, and then they won't be afraid to fight the Israelis, and they will, and although they might be tagged as terrorists, then we will remember the wise words of a great communist called George Habash, and that was that resistance is not terrorism. Thank you very much.
Ghada's given us a very sober and very sombre perspective on what's happening in Palestine, and justifiably so. I think it's, to reiterate, though I think the fact that the Palestinians don't simply just give up and die, I think the fact that people are still defiant, they still raise their fist at Israel, is remarkable, and is also, I think, one of the things that has contributed to evoking solidarity in countries like Britain and elsewhere, that people identify the Palestinians not simply as victims, but as fighters. And I think that's incredibly impressive for all the weakness of the Palestinian people economically and so on. The second thing, though, and I'd be interested in Ghada's view on this, it's something to think about, to add to our picture, is why does the West give impunity to Israel? Now, we all know the answer, that Israel has been funded and backed by the West to create an armed camp in one of the most crucial oil-rich regions of the world. I see John Rose there. I read his pamphlet about Israel, the hijacked state, as the watchdog for Western imperialism. That's why it's funded. Isn't it interesting, though, that in the last 2 decades, situations have arisen, and one's just arisen again, where there are threats to Western hegemony that emerge, where, unlike in the 50s and 60s, where Israel was unleashed, say, against Nasser and so on to destroy him, the West has either directly intervened or held back Israel. Look at ISIS. Look at the emergence of ISIS. It sent a crisis in Washington. Who are they talking about having to ally with? Iran, for God's sake, right? Why not Israel? Why not send in Israel, right? This armed camp that you funded to the tune of billions, because they know that would be explosive across the region. Explosive. And that has created a tension. There is a contradiction. I'm not saying it's very easy how it plays out for the Palestinians, but it is, in a sense, a weakening of imperialism across the region, and that's worth thinking about. Final point is, someone earlier talked about the interplay between the Palestinians and the Arabs, and what Ghada mentioned about the tunnels. It's vivid, isn't it? Every advance of the masses, every advance of the revolution in Egypt relieves some of the pressure on the Palestinians and begins to point to, at least opens the door to freedom. Every advance of the counter-revolution in Egypt begins to close that door. The fates of the Palestinian people are utterly interdependent and intertwined with the Egyptian masses, the Syrian masses, and so on. We have to be sober about the picture, but we also have to understand the dynamic.
After our next speaker, we'll have the gentleman in the green top here in the third row. Yeah.
So I'm Israeli, and I share the complete lack of optimism with the speaker. Having grown up in that society, I moved here when I was 8, but the level of racism that is ingrained into you, the Arabs are not people. I heard people march on the streets when I was 6 years old chanting death to Arabs. When my sister wasn't playing the recorder well in her lesson, her teacher told her to stop playing like an Arab. The change has to come from outside the country, because speaking to even my family who are still there, who are soldiers, they see what they're doing, and within themselves, they might not be racist within their own mentality, but they don't want change and they don't want peace. All they want to do is continue the oppression and make Israel, well, as far as I can see it, a wholly Jewish nation. They want the Palestinians gone. Now, a good example of the way that the British really built Israel and made it as it is today is the fact that I lived on Balfour Road and I went to Balfour School. The British have made Israel what it is, and I think the way to topple this disgusting apartheid really just has to come from us.
I had the great privilege over the last few years of working with Ghada Karmi, especially in our union, the University College and Lecturers Union, UCU, and we, with her assistance, to introduce the boycott campaign into our union. We had a tremendous row and debate at one of our conferences 5 or 6 years ago. And it was a debate, actually a very, very moderate debate. It wasn't even a debate about supporting the boycott, it was a debate about the right to debate the boycott in our UCU branches. And it led to the most fearsome fight with the Zionists, a really bitter fight with the Zionists. It's on the front page of the Weekly Jewish Chronicle every single week for many, many weeks. And it got a tremendous amount of publicity. And to such an extent, and this very much underlines Rada's point about British complicity, to such an extent, and we won the vote, to such an extent, after we won the vote, Tony Blair, Prime Minister, phones up Olmert, the Israeli Prime Minister, to apologise on behalf of our union. And to apologise that such a union in Britain could do such a thing. I mean, completely mind-boggling. I mean, bonkers at one level, and he is now, without doubt. But at the same time, it really underlines the viciousness of this complicity. And I always think that one of our tasks is to become ideological prize fighters. We have to break down the arguments, individually in individual arguments, in the campuses, or in the coffee bars, with the campaigns and demonstrations on the streets. That's incredibly important. And BDS certainly provides a vehicle for raising the ideological argument in a far more dramatic way. And there's no question, however cocky, and they do look unbearably self-confident so often, the Israelis, but they are undermined by this BDS campaign. There was a special paper commissioned by the Israeli cabinet which warned them this was being effective, because although they're very, very strong militarily, they do rely on this ideological base in the West. And it's not just about governments, there are some degree of public support, and that's where what we do really matters, is breaking down this public support. Now, I haven't got the time to go into it, but especially the students and the lecturers in the room, we need to make BDS much more effective on the campuses. And that requires some subtlety. Very often the lecturers who are complicit in what are usually high-tech and biotech deals with Israeli universities aren't inside our union. They're doing things very privately, dressed up in the cover of scientific research, so we have to do the research. We have to identify the individuals. Where we find lecturers and professors who are complicit, then we need a bit of subtlety. We go and visit them, and for a quiet chat to begin with, putting out, drip by drip, bits of publicity. This is going on, build up a kind of campaign. It's been done in various places, but we have to really intensify it. There's absolutely no question the Palestinians are watching. BDS is now out and about. These three letters are really powerful, but we have to really make them bigger, we have to make them far more powerful, and it depends on all of us in this room. And the campus is very important. Just very, very quickly, one very final point about what happens inside Israel. One of the interesting effects of the breakdown of the two-state solution, raising the question of a one-state solution, does raise the possibility of a breakdown of the Palestinian Authority, or at least a section of the more progressive elements being forced to campaign for one person, one vote, including the refugees, across the territories. That remains a different political strategy. It's in the back of people's minds. It could suddenly erupt, and we need to be aware that it might erupt and be ready to give it the maximum solidarity it requires.
The working classes of the Middle East are central. But we live in this country, and you have to fight where you are. So I got involved in Stop the JNF. The Jewish National Fund is a core Zionist organisation. It's racist, it's complicit in ethnic cleansing, and according to one of its previous directors, it's an obstacle to peace. Because what the Jewish National Fund was doing was helping ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem. So you think, well, okay, we'll campaign against that. It turns out that the Jewish National Fund is a British charity. So to be a British charity, you have to act for the public good. So you think, well, that's all right, well, complain. So you chuck in your complaints. There is a law that says you're not allowed to be racist in this country. There is one exception if you're a charity. Charities, no, seriously, there's a logic. If you have a charity for giving material support to gypsies, to Roma, to whoever, there is a logic. The notion that the Jewish National Fund should be a charity that is aiding the oppressor, the Palestinians, is an outrage. So you complain to the Charity Commission, and who do you get? Sir William Shawcross. So William Shawcross was a founder member of a pro-Israeli organisation, and he was also director of the William Jackson Society. So he's a nasty right-wing card carrier. Anyway, so you campaign, and you know, I feel that most of the time the media presents this Palestinians and Israelis a conflict of equal. If you say prove that the JNF is for the public good, then the onus is on them to prove it. So I think it's worthwhile campaigning against. The other point is that I am active, but I'm active for our own interests as well. If we can say, for example, why did the BBC mention the Nakba as a time when thousands of Palestinians, not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, thousands of Palestinians left their homes, not ethnically cleansed, they just left their homes like we left our homes to come here. Absolutely disgraceful. Why does the BBC do that? And the last speaker was dead right. I used to work at Sheffield Hallam, and the Palestinian Society had a meeting, first inaugural meeting, got 83 people to it. It is fantastic. People are open, and if they're open to that, they're open to other things. And we shouldn't forget that Blair was massively, fatally, politically wounded when he supported the Israeli attacks on Lebanon. So fight in solidarity, all the different campaigns, G4S, Stop the JNF, BDS, Sainsbury's and the rest of it, but at the same time weave it into why is our ruling class supporting the oppression of Palestinians.
Thank you, comrade, for that. And for our final speaker from the floor. Thank you.
I just want to understand, why is it that when we've got children in Palestine dying and we've got this little bit of sympathy but no one's really doing much, we've got young kids and a baby was like burnt last week, it's not something that we should, like, I don't understand the logic behind it. These are little children that are dying. Also, I feel in England, the education doesn't show the Palestinian side. I've done history GCSE and A-level now, and so far when I'm studying about the Arab and Israeli war, for example, when we're studying about Yom Kippur, we know it's the Jewish holy day, but does anyone know that it was the 10th day of Ramadan? Like, I don't understand the logic behind it. We're called terrorists, but are they the real terrorists? I don't get it. Like, people also don't understand the fact that we don't hate Jews because we were civilized human beings as well. We, as Arab nations, we used to live with the Christians and the Orthodox Jews together, and we were all peaceful. I've got people that came up to me and said to me, "Do you hate Jews?" I don't hate Jews as people from a religion. I don't agree with Zionists, of course, but I don't hate Jews. They're, believers of a religion. Also, I don't get it because my friend is Palestinian, and when he went back home, he was beaten up, but that wasn't on the news because it wasn't a time where the Israelis attacked the Palestinians, but he was beaten up and he got an apology from an Israeli soldier. That's not going to get his nose that was broken back. That's not going to bring back his injuries. Also, if you realise, it's a consistent kind of thing. Every Ramadan, they are attacking the Muslims. Every New Year's Day, every Eid, they attack us. If there was an instant where Hamas had bombed, because they are weak and they don't have the best facilities, they bombed a tree. So a tree was, they took they had the right basically to kill more humans. I don't get that. At the end of the day, if they were Palestinians or not, Palestinians are not just Muslims, they're also Christians, and some are not non-believers. I don't understand the logic behind where Israel is supported. To what, I don't understand from one person or a couple of people, a room of us that are going to boycott Israel by not, for example, going to Starbucks or Marks and Spencer's or stuff like that. It's not going to, I don't believe that it's going to work like that. I think it has to be publicly spoken, and we have to emphasise, I'm sick of it, it's because on BBC, we Arabs are known to be terrorists, but can't people open their eyes and realise it's actually the Israelis?
I'll turn it over now to Ghada Karmi to respond to the discussions that have been had and to bring us a bit of a summary.
Yeah. First of all, thanks to everyone who made some really important points. It's very, very encouraging to see people who are so engaged in this issue. And an apology if I come across as depressing, I think some person described it, or as somber, I think somebody put it more, you know. Look, what I didn't want to do is to come along with this stock thing of saying, we will overcome, and you know, don't worry, I know it's bad now, but you know, it's going to be different. We have to look at things in the, we have to, and that's the only way we're going to get any sort of action. And that's really what I meant to say. Now, let me just quickly run through some really important points. First of all, a big congratulations to the comrade who talked about the soda stream and shutting down the shop in Brighton. I knew about that. I thought it was absolutely brilliant and such a very good illustration of what can be done, as he said, which brings me just to quickly say the reason why BDS is such a good instrument for this kind of thing is that the actions that it's able to achieve are quite modest, in fact, but their effect on the Israeli establishment is fantastic. The Israeli government, exactly as John Rose said, is terribly worried about BDS. There is an awful lot of anxiety about the legitimacy of Israel, and that this is being called into question. And so never underestimate the effect of quite small actions on in this issue, because they affect the Israelis so much. It's quite interesting. I mean, Israel really has a view that not only should it do what it likes, but people should like it as well. So when it finds it's not actually liked, it's a terrible shock. So anyway, now in terms of the Arab Spring, the one comrade talked about being optimistic, that this was a sort of a temporary thing. That as may be, but for the Palestinians there is no time. I mean, we really have to understand that things are, time is of the essence. There's a race on. The Israelis certainly know that. Now, as for the shift, yes, of course there are some hopeful things. I didn't mean to imply that there's nothing that's hopeful, and that there's nothing that we can take heart from. Of course there is. Of course there's been a shift in public, and I know that. I've lived nearly all my life in England. I can remember how it used to be, where nobody had heard of Palestinians, and today, where, thanks to the sacrifice of the poor people of Gaza, so much more awareness, so much more sympathy amongst the bulk of ordinary people. Of course there has been. Now, in terms of defiance and the Palestinians not lying down, of course, there's no way, I hope, I implied that the Palestinian people who are obviously at the receiving end of all this are kind of have given up, and they have not. And that's, of course, as you said, whoever it was, that's why they're admirable, that's why people love to support them. It's inspiring, there's no question about it. They will do that. But what I want to do, what I don't want, is any kind of complacency. That, and I'm not accusing anybody here, but one must be very careful. If you say, gosh, and they're real fighters, and you know, actually, you know, there's a limit to people's endurance, and it doesn't go on and on and on. Now, in terms of the PA, somebody raised a very good point. I didn't go there because it would make the whole talk far too long. The PA indeed has played a role which we cannot admire at all in enabling Israel to do all kinds of things, not least the so-called security collaboration between the two sides, which is one of the most pernicious things that the Israelis managed to do, that the Palestinians police themselves. The Israelis police the Palestinians police themselves on Israel's behalf. And indeed, there has to be a decision made, but that is an internal Palestinian decision on how to dismantle the PA, because the PA is a real obstacle to any way forward. Why does the West support Israel? Well, you see, in a way, they do, and it's no good. We can't talk about these things all the time. We know, we understand they do. The fact is they do. and we have to do something about it. That's my starting point. In terms of ISIS, somebody raised the point about ISIS and Israel. It's very interesting, you know. One of the questions that I kept hearing again and again in Jordan was, why doesn't ISIS turn its attentions to Israel? Because if you think about it, ISIS stands for, you know, all unbelievers shall be destroyed, and so on. Well, you've got a load of unbelievers over the border, and so it's a very good question, that why don't they do it? It's led many Arabs, by the way, Arabs are addicted to conspiracy theories, and many Arabs are going around saying that ISIS has been made by Israel. It's a kind of an Israel product. That's why they don't attack it. Anyway, in terms of Balfour, yes, whoever mentioned Balfour, I think you did, Sabi, and somebody else, of course, and our young Israeli friend, of course, after all, if you think about it, there never ever would have been an Israel, ever, without Britain. No question about it. And it was Balfour, representing the British government, who spearheaded the movement to create Israel. Somebody said you should work where you are, and you are so right. It was a point I was trying to make, to help from where you are. What can you do in your own environment? How can you affect change around you, and then it will feed in to help the Palestinians. And the Jewish National Fund, which is a whole other story, is an excellent place to start. Finally, in terms of, well, there's a question about education. That's right. Our friend who was talking about she hadn't been taught about that. Indeed, the educational syllabus is not, it does not deal with this issue fairly. The Holocaust story has pride of place in the educational syllabus of British school children. You know, in the end, I mean, you know, in the end, these Western powers that support Israel, they really do have to, I think, they do have to ask it. They do have to, first of all, say to Israel, look, we know that what you want is the whole territory between the river and the sea. We know that. It's obvious. Our question to you is this: what will you do with the Palestinian people? I really think it's a very real question that has to be put to Israel. I mean in its own terms, in the terms of its own logic. It says it will, or rather that's its aim, to take over all that territory. But you know, 5 million people in Gaza and in the West Bank, you put them together. What does Israel plan for these people? And if only I had time, but I didn't want to go there. Of course, John Rose was absolutely right. One of the ways forward, I believe, for the Palestinians, this is, I'm not talking about what audiences here, an audience would do here, BDS. One of the most important ways the Palestinians could smash this whole structure, undermine this whole edifice on which these lies and these delusions have been based, the peace process, a two-state solution, all that sort of thing. The most effective way is if they confronted Israel with a demand for equal rights. Imagine how that would end and overturn the total status quo. Just imagine that for a moment, that the Palestinians say to Israel, look, cut the crap, you are ruling us. We know that. There is this intermediary body called the PA, which is a big charade. The reality is you rule us. Fine, that's fine. You can rule us, but what you cannot do is give us no rights and no equal rights. So we demand equal rights, even Israeli citizenship. I'd love to see the Palestinians say that, and I would love to see Israel's reaction when asked for Israeli citizenship for people that it is ruling. That, I assure you, in my view anyway, would be the quickest, the most direct, and the most intelligent way to put a stop to all this stuff. I wish I were in a position to make it happen.